a few housekeeping items. So as Kelly had mentioned earlier, we're going to keep everybody on mute throughout the webinar. So please make sure that it remains that way, just so, again, there's no background noise and no confusion with all of us on this call. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom. So some people have already written comments, which is great. So yeah, throughout the webinar, just please feel free to type in your comments there and any questions you have. So another thing is that this webinar will be recorded, and after all is done and all is said today, we will be sending out a link with to that recording and also to other materials that we will reference throughout this webinar. Okay, and so just for the general format, we're going to start off with kind of like a brief question response period, followed by a background overview of the context given by Daniela. And then Josh and Daniela will go more deeply into the resource and present a few case studies. And finally, we're going to open up the floor to any kind of questions before having a few closing announcements. So again, I'm super excited. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to pass over the stage to Josh and Daniela.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. We are big fans of Recode in return, indeed. I wonder, I'm sure there's probably a lot of Canadians who know about Recode, and those who don't, I'm sure it'll be in the links that we send you afterward. So thanks for joining us. There's so many of you on the call. What we thought we would do to kick off is, we're not sure how many of you have already read the resource. I'm going to take my earrings off because I think they're clicking. Or not. So no problem if you haven't, because the point of this webinar was actually to walk through it. But we thought some of you maybe already have or have skimmed it and might have some questions for us already. And we'd rather take some of those in advance so we can make sure that we align with your expectations. So if you want to take a second and type into the chat, if you have a pressing question, or if you just want to say, here's why I joined today, something, why are you here? You're obviously giving us your time. So please do that. And if there's anyone who's calling in, we could maybe, have enough time to hear from one or two voices. If you aren't able to chat, feel free to give us like a 15-second sound burst, unmute yourself for 15 seconds if you need to. But others, please just type in so we can see what you're hoping to hear about today or why you joined. And we'll wait a second for that to happen. And if no one says anything, Josh, I guess we can talk about whatever we like. Okay. Is anyone, I'm not seeing anything, or is it just, that's just me? Oh, good. No expectations, just here to learn. Okay. For models, great. Perfect. Is there a way to do, maybe it's too complicated, but let us know if, if you have a pressing question, go for it. And if not, we're just going to start. Great. Okay. While you guys are typing, I'm just going to give you some quick background on where this report came from and why we wrote it. So we organized a convening, or I was working at Yale last fall. And so in partnership with the program on entrepreneurship at Yale, where I was based, I was working with Sheila Marcella from care.com and to organize this systems change education convening. And the reason that we decided to start that was because I had seen from an educator's view, and she had seen from within corporations, that we do a lot of teaching about entrepreneurship, and in the same way about social entrepreneurship. So boot camps and startups, and how do I get funding, and how do I, find a social investor, and what should my business model be like? And what we saw, both of us saw missing, both from the education piece and from the hiring piece in the talent pool, was a systems thinking, a skill set that was aligned with a social impact value set. And so what we thought was, let's gather some educators who we know are really prominent in their field around social entrepreneurship, and others who are prominent in their field around system change, system thinking. And we knew that systems and the concept of systems change has been taught for a really long time. It's not a new concept. But what is new is that in the world of social innovation. It is a very popular topic right now, and I'm sure many of you would know that, and that's why you're here, and that's why we have so many people here. So we had the same sort of situation at Yale. So many people decided they wanted to join, and what we organized at Yale, and I'm going to now share my screen with you so you can see the website that we created out of the back of this, is we made a gallery walk. And at Yale, we actually made a physical gallery walk. People gave us their curricula, their their grading rubrics. They gave us the outlines of their courses or their frameworks from which they teach systems thinking or systems change. And we framed all of those in this 2 or 3 room complex, and we had those all over the walls, and we had like an audio tour, and it was really fun part of our 2-day experience, where we went around and we saw these amazing resources that the cohort had brought together. And we figured, gosh, if we collected all these things, we might as well make those available online. So this website, systemschangeeducation.com, has a link to the report up here, but it also has a link to the gallery walk. And I just wanted to show you in case you haven't seen it. So it was, some of these things were hard to divide up because some of them are initiatives and tools, but we tried to divide it up. This is a set of programming, of programs that some of which are featured in our report. These are frameworks of different ways of thinking about systems change. Here's different approaches and fellowships, et cetera, at universities that are related to that. And then here are the list of these are different people's views of what systems change competencies are, right? And so we'll talk about that in a second. We synthesize that for our report. And then there's actual case studies and syllabi here. So, you can click on any of these, and then it talks to you about the cases that are available, and you can then click on and download the resource or view it. So please do take a look at that. And then at the top here, you'll see there's the report, so you can download the full report. And then a piece of the report that we'll get into later is educational innovations, and we've made those available on the website too. So I just wanted to make sure you all saw that resource. So last minute from me on the convening. Was at the convening, one of the things that we did was we asked everyone to share, here's what we think we're normally teaching in our social innovation frameworks and our world of social innovation, hackathons, courses, co-curricular activities. And here's what we think is missing to add a systems lens or a systems-led approach to those courses. And so everyone shared both from their own actual frameworks, which some of you have just seen, which you've just seen in our gallery walk. And we had these little pieces of paper, and we hung them up on clothespins all over, and then put that all into a spreadsheet. And that led us to saying, well, now that we have all this data, we might as well kind of write it up and say, as a collective group of 40 people, here's what we think is missing. And we'll get into some highlighting some of the examples that maybe can show you why we think this type of approach is really valuable both in the classroom and for our students as they leave the classroom. So Josh, over to you to maybe open up the report and then highlight for everyone what those competencies are that we pulled out.
Great, thanks Daniela. If you stop sharing your
Yep.
screen, then I will. So first of all, hi everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us. I think as we dive into the report and specifically the competencies, I would say that, contextually, just to underscore aspects of what Daniela shared, I think that the gathering at Yale that this came out of really speaks to a larger trend in the field of both social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and systems change coming together to answer the most pressing challenges that face society. And I think that the Yale gathering was one group of folks. Yes, it was international. And I would also just put out there that there are many groups around the world who are grappling with these same questions and taking different kinds of approaches, both across Canada and in many regions across Canada, and then of course internationally as well, that this report highlights some of those perspectives. So again, part of the reason that we synthesize this as a shared resource is to point to the pathways and sort of the inroads or the doorways that we can walk through as we continue to explore together. How do we support education in the 21st century to be more relevant to the challenges we face? How do we have education be a leverage point that can enable people to learn, lead, and live together in ways that actually are congruent with the challenges and also the solutions that may be possible? So I think part of the context, though, is that there was a great sense at the gathering at Yale that we don't have all the answers, and that these competencies that I'll share with you right now are tips of the iceberg of a lot of people's areas of practice and expertise. So I know there's lots of people on this call who bring great expertise, some who are at the gathering that this report came out of as well. So again, we're looking forward to go through this relatively quickly as an overview and then open it up later so we can all talk together. So having said that, this report is a live doc. I'm going to be scrolling. I'll try to do it relatively slow enough so that it doesn't make any of us dizzy. But this is actually the report and the activity that Daniela just framed for us in terms of an ideation of fundamental skills. The list that you'll see in front of you, it was broken up into two specific parts, one of which in the ideation process focused on what are the skills that any practitioner or learner or leader might want to cultivate when developing a systems practice or a systems approach within their classroom. And so what you'll see is everything from reflection and listening to multi-stakeholder perspectives to socio-ecological justice. And these just sort of pointed to the kinds of areas that would be helpful in regard to understanding the interrelated complexities, understanding systems, and understanding what changes within those systems might need in order to be facilitated. And then as we went deeper into practitioner skills and areas of practice, it went more specific into the kind of competencies or capacities that one would need to be able to, for example, facilitate multi-stakeholder change initiatives, not as a concept, but really as a practice. Or how might we include meditation or relationship building as skill sets and methodologies that are really required and often overlooked as soft skills. So I think one of the big takeaways that I certainly had when we were exploring this was that there was a big blend or a spectrum of things that we tend to place on a future skills spectrum, at least, from soft skills to hard skills to science to STEM to how do we have a personal practice that might support us as individual facilitators. And this sort of exploration led us to building essentially, I guess you would call it a competency framework, but I even hesitate to call it that. I mean, really it was an integration of what we were seeing across the competencies and how we decided to put it together in terms of areas of systems competency, connected from deep inner work or having a self-awareness practice that would enable people to be able to cultivate the sense of well-being, the sense of knowing who one is as an innovator, as an individual, and being able to develop leadership capacities that could enable us to hold the great tensions and paradoxes that is often present in this work. And then connecting that to a systems orientation or an understanding of our individual, collective, and systemic relationship across multiple fields of scale, and understanding the interrelationships, or beginning to, and then applying systems, tools, and frameworks, and then on to practicing and participatory methods for multi-stakeholder collaboration. And so for us, I think one thing that would be helpful to point out is that there are many pathways that one could go through to cultivate skills or capacities at any of these levels. And that in a sense, as a friend and colleague of mine, Jessica Bolduc here in Canada, and I were just speaking before the webinar, I think that competencies or capacities can be a challenging way of framing this. In a sense, it often is more about creating generative learning spaces where we're able to bring forward what it is that we're learning from different worldviews and perspectives, and weave that together in an application that is relevant to our given context. And so, for example, in higher education, what we'll explore further here in a minute is expressions of how people are taking these competency areas and applying them in different scholastic approaches. And yet at the same time, there's a huge practitioner led movement of people using these tools and methods and approaches within civil society. So I think that there's an opportunity, and as we'll play more through this in the conversation, to see lots of different applications of this. And maybe I'll just leave it there for the moment, and Daniela, invite you to share anything more around the competencies or some of the other pieces before we move on.
Sure. I was just going to add one thing. I mean, you touched on it, but basically what I heard you say and what I know that we struggled with was there are competencies that we hope our students walk away with, but the reality is that to get there, educators need to embody that way of working, right? We can't teach in a linear A plus B equals C way, and like trying to instill knowledge into our students' brains if we don't embrace the complexity and have our classrooms embrace that complexity, they're not going to be able to then embrace that competency as well. So what we found was when we talk about inner work, that's both a competency that we hope that the students in our classrooms will engage in and be able to take with them. But it's also something that we as educators need to be doing in this process, right? And so when you go out of that circle to the practices and participatory methods, that's really an onus on the educator to say, like, how are we creating a classroom that has knowledge equity and embraces the value of lived experience of those who have lived experience of inequities, right? How are we creating a classroom that allows for different opinions and like explores, deepens into the complexity of issues where there isn't a correct answer, when students might have had that systems way of thinking taught out of them. We know that they have it by nature as young people, and unfortunately it's been taught out of them. So that was something I just wanted to highlight there. Great.
So I'll scroll down a little bit. And one thing to add within the report, and specifically because of who was participating at the event, there are later on case studies, but for each of these competency areas, there's organizations or projects that we're pointing to. So for example, in inner work.
And it links to the gallery walk. It links to the gallery walk that we saw.
It does. So whether it's the Academy for Systems Change or Presencing Institute or Omidyar, there's many groups who are working on many of these elements, as we said before. I won't go through all of them now, but again, because there's many people on the call who are working in these areas, this was really meant to be a tip of the iceberg. And I feel like even in regard to the competency areas that we highlighted, or in regard to the kinds of skills fundamentally or practitioner-wise, I think there's a lot more to be said and deepen into. And Daniela, you were just speaking to this idea of knowledge and equity in the classroom. This was an area that we could say much more about, but also I think people are grappling with, not only as educators, how do we bring ourselves into the process of learning with our students and with our communities, but also how do we shift the onus of the individual from one who's building capacity for themselves to build capacity to contribute to the larger challenges that we're facing.
And I'll give a 30 seconds on an example for that. Neighbors and residents right there at Yale. What they have done is they've recognized that they have leaders in the New Haven community who are deeply involved in social change work, working on different issues. And while they have all these beautiful residency programs where they're taking in people from all around the world to access Yale and to engage with students and to enrich the classroom, they didn't have a program that was actually taking these leaders right from New Haven. And so this program provides basically the recognition that when you bring a lived experience leader who is taking charge and leading on an issue of change into the classroom, it's actually more beneficial for the students than it is to that leader who's getting access to Yale. Yeah, that's nice, but really you're enriching your classroom. And so they actually pay the neighbors and residents to do this program and to hold office hours. And then they have access to any class they want at Yale. So hopefully it's reciprocally beneficial. And they've definitely found that student initiatives that were kind of maybe not based in a strong understanding of a problem, once they can meet with a community leader who says, hey, we don't, we think maybe you need to do a bit more research here, or why don't you shift in this direction? It's been really helpful for the students as well. So that's one example of a program that you could look into.
And, I think one of the big conversations that we're having in Canada in general around social innovation is the relationship between social innovation practitioners and Indigenous-led social innovation practitioners and leaders. And I think just to underscore this area particularly, there's such a vast difference between innovation for progress and innovation for survival. And I think that this idea of innovation for survival as a key differentiator for what's the context within which we're using these tools. I think that if we're in a higher education standpoint going to be developing capacities to address complex challenges, then we need to be having the classroom reflect not only who is represented in the challenges we're facing, but also in the methodologies that we use to be able to set the context for collaborating together.
Let me just pause there. The other resource that we could link to and is worth looking at in that is Baljit Sandhu's report on the value of lived experience. So we can add that in the follow-up links. And she's the one leading the Knowledge Equity Initiative at Yale that is basically saying, why are all the case studies that we see and we read about either about people who don't have lived experience, written by people who don't have lived experience? How do we shift that so that the voices of those who with lived experience are in our classrooms as well? And it goes well beyond that. I'm actually not fully up to date on what they're taking on, but I know that it's definitely something I'm going to follow along with.
And I'm just watching some of the comments come in, and I realize, it's hard in an hour conversation to go as deep into any of these things as they deserve. But I would add that for me, this idea of innovation for progress or innovation for survival came from conversations with Mulaney Goodchild and the Turtle Island Institute. And I just think it's another area where people could follow up for further exploration in regard of amazing case studies for how people are navigating these incredibly challenging parts of this work.
Great. Yeah, the funding piece just basically says we need to change how we fund too, right? Because if we're funding based on financial ROI of an individual organization, we can't then take on these systems challenges that are going to require multi-organizational efforts and individual efforts. So maybe we can scroll down. So what we did was we looked at internally with those people who joined us at Yale, and then outside of that as well, to give some examples of what is happening, what initiatives are already being taken, and what areas we think there's opportunity for change. So one was a big area for change in the social innovation, social entrepreneurship, education realm is this idea of the accelerator incubator program being tied to a program or service, an initiative, a product or service, excuse me. And so a lot of times the way that accelerators applications work, you have to apply with, here's my idea for a business, right? And what we're basically saying is we need to step backwards and help students think about a problem at a systems level before they've decided they're going to start a business, right? So I have students say to me, oh, I'm so excited to be a social entrepreneur. I just need to figure out my business model and my problem, right? And so that was the impetus for me to start thinking about, you know, we need to shift this, because it's not just about business models. And of course, it's not just about picking a problem out of a hat. It's about deeply understanding something, right? And so if you scroll down, there's a few examples here. The EP Peace Incubator at University of Waterloo is really interesting. They take social entrepreneurs and give them training of how to interact with politicians and handhold them for introductions, either to sell their product or service into government, to advocate for changes in government policy, you know, so they help them think through what needs to shift in the government in order to further the social impact that you're working on, which is fabulous. And the other one I want to highlight, just because I'm happy for you to reach out to me if you're interested. If because I won't go through all of them. You can look up School of System Change. They offer programming. So if you have anyone who's like, gosh, I really want to learn, they offer programming for people who are well beyond, you know, not just students. So, you know, we could all go join that type of programming as well if you're interested. But if you could scroll down to Map the System, Josh, I just want to highlight. Yeah.
Sorry, just one thing, just so everybody knows.
Sorry, Laura. Yeah. Yes, go for it, Josh. Go for it.
So Laura Wynn
and
Anna Briney are co-authors of this report as well. And you know, their work with the School of Systems Change, I won't repeat what Daniela just said, but I think that their perspectives really played into the framing and the context of the report, as well as many other parts as well. So we'll add links to their work in the follow-up.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, that was in a different one. So we added questions for educators at the bottom of each of these sections, and you can look through those to say, like, I want to rethink my own accelerator program. Here's questions that might help you think through that. Okay, supporting systems understanding before solutions pitching. That actually has Map the System in it. You can scroll down to that, Josh. This was a concept of saying, how do we incentivize students to understand systems, right? Currently, we're doing a lot of, you know, hackathon, like even design thinking classes. Oftentimes, the description of the class or the program says, you will learn, you know, how to think about your client's needs, or it has the word client in the first sentence. A client is already assuming I'm doing something, I'm selling them a product or service, right? What if it's about building a movement or creating an education platform or changing policies, right? So I think there's a bias towards thinking that clients is moving students towards a business model. So Map the System is a competition hosted by the School Center at Oxford. Any university or education program that offers like multi-month education programming around social innovation can join, and we'll send a link to that. But the idea is that instead of winning because I'm pitching and I have the best business idea to solve a problem, you win by pitching your understanding of the problem. Here's what's happening. Here's the numbers. Here's what's holding it in place. Here's who benefits from the problem staying as it is. And your understanding of the landscape of current solutions. Who's already trying to solve it? And then taking an approach to look at gaps and levers of change. And alongside that, in partnership with Mount Royal University, we created a toolkit for a student guide to mapping the system. But I know a lot of people are using that well outside the Map the System competition, so we'll be happy to link to that as well, in case that's a useful resource for you. And some educators are using that in the classroom because it has lots of tools for how to teach students to think in this way. So maybe we can just scroll down, and I won't go through all of them, but there's other competitions that have rethought their programming to allow for policy change and other initiatives by students that are beyond just the business venture. So valuing lived experience, we already gave a nod to Baljit Sandhu. Her link is right there. And most of this, like, she was deeply involved in helping to write these pieces. So there's the Knowledge Equity Initiative and the Neighbors in Residence program that we've already touched on, and I would highly recommend looking at those. But those are questions that we can ask: is how in our classroom, who is what types of problems are our students trying to take on? Have they lived those problems? Have we talked about that, the value of lived expertise? And if they haven't lived them, how do we provide opportunities for them to, next part here, apprentice with a problem? So we use that term as a juxtaposition to lived experience. So I haven't lived something. How do I earn the right to bestow my benevolence in an area? How do I earn the right to start to work on an issue that I don't yet understand, right? And I think that's an opportunity we have in our classroom, is just to even talk about it that way, that, gosh, we don't just fund students to hop on a plane and say, hi, I'm here to help you, even though I know nothing about what's going on here. Instead, it's, hi, I'm here to learn how I can be of help, right? So apprenticing with a problem funding was something that McConnell and TRICO are still funding across Canada as partnership with Map the System across Canada, which McConnell and TRICO have partnered on having a Canadian final for Map the System. For all the students who are the top students in the final of Map the System for Canada, they have an opportunity to get funding to go learn more and go apprentice with these problems. So that could be something you think about initiating at your university or in your classroom. Josh, do you want to add sentences about your course right here, or do you want to?
I mean, I can briefly, in that the Permaculture for Systemic Change course is a program that I've ran at Prescott College in Arizona, and it looked at U.S.-Mexico border region as a place to be able to bring systems approaches, including permaculture design, social practices such as collaborative leadership models, and sustainability perspectives into addressing complex challenges on the border and in the binational region. So I think, again, this just points to other examples around the world, many of which are not necessarily represented here, but, these complex challenges look and feel different wherever our work may be. And I think that there's a red thread, for me at least, through experiential education around how do we build the capacity through our practice to enable developing the skills that would be required by actually working on these challenges where they matter most. So I won't say more about that now, but
yeah. And then I love this question that's come up. So let's just go really quick and let's get to this open conversation. But the final section here was on educational ecosystems. So taking a either collective impact approach or systems approach by bringing those of us together who are working on these issues. And one of the examples that we put in there is of course Ashoka U. And if you don't know about them and their work, definitely read through that, because that's another opportunity for educators to get involved in getting training and learning and sharing resources. So the question from Josephine right now was, what's the next steps for this collective? Is there a future gathering of the community? Is there any discussion of online space to share best practices or resources? I love that question. Thanks, Josephine. And that's what we want to leave you with right now. We have 22 minutes left. What are the pressing questions that you have? And then that was one of the questions that we had, is like, what is needed, or what is their interest and appetite for to take this work further? Because as Josh said, this is the tip of the iceberg. What are people interested in from here? So questions and what's next? Over to you guys, and you feel free to unmute yourself or type or whatever you like. Feel free to speak too. If you have thoughts or questions, go ahead, go for it.
Hi, I'm Nancy Marlette from the University of Calgary. I'm in the Faculty of Medicine, and I run a very disruptive and cheeky program called Patient Community Engagement Researcher, where we train through a one-year program patients as non-traditional learners. And it's been fascinating to see how their presence within a university community actually leads people really hard to some of these ideas without a presence, an actual reality that's there. I love the one so
Have more diversified classrooms.
How do we bring examples into the dialogue? And how do we expand our ability to network? I think all of us who are working in this area feel very alone.
Yeah, do people have thoughts on that or questions on that? Do other people have?
Well, I mean, I would just, one thing that comes up for me, we didn't focus too much on it now for the sake of time, but I do think that this educational ecosystems idea and Recode's work itself, actually, who's hosting us here today, is really about providing the social infrastructure and connecting the dots between community members, higher education, K-12, and in essence, this ecosystem idea is about connecting self-directed, lifelong learning collaboratives of people who connect through universities and local place-based issues in order to address systems level needs and challenges. And so I think that part of the loneliness or the lone innovator approach or the lone founder approach is one of the great challenges that we're facing in regard to breaking down barriers and silos to be able actually to learn together in new and different ways.
Yeah, and there was a great question here from Blake from BU saying, what are ways to frame this conversation with decision makers on our campus? Blake, I just want to point you towards in the gallery walk, number 25 is the Master of Sustainable Peace Building. And Tim Ellinger, I think that course was also co-founded by Robert Sigliano, who's now at Omidyar Group. And one of the things that he found was they spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we frame this stuff for the CV, right? And it's the same thing for, for the leadership of our universities, to show that actually this way of teaching is providing necessary skills for the jobs of the future, and is filling in the necessary skills that the university already thinks that these students need to learn. So he would be a great person for you to connect with. But I think that if you consider that this convening at Yale was co-organized or initiated by the CEO of a public company, because she was also seeing what we were seeing, that we need to change how we educate, right? We can find people who are great program managers, web designers, et cetera, but how do we find people that are thinking about systems in a holistic way? So there is certainly a tie to jobs of the future. But that is an opportunity for growth too, is how do we create the vocabulary to convince people that this is necessary.
And I think we have Anita.
Hi, okay, so I'm unmuted. It's so delightful to spend time with other systems change educators. So thank you for this, and thank you for Recode. I've been teaching social entrepreneurship at McGill since 2012, and in my very, very first cohort, I actually see that somebody on this call was a member of my original class. So I don't know what's happened to you, Diana, but we obviously have to catch up. One of the things that struck me in listening to what you've shared, I haven't actually read the report. I'm really so delighted when I'm seeing things like, inner work and the value of lived experience and the sort of social justice orientation that it seems to be taking. This is a share, but one of the tools that I've been using for years is Marshall Gann's public narrative, where students are invited to say it's only 3 minutes, it's a tight little 3 minutes, using the technology of the public narrative to share a story about why a social issue is of particular importance to them. And it really is the defining before and after of the class, when before it's a set of students, no matter how much I co-create or try to co-create a great vibe in the class, that class, when everybody shares their public narrative, provides a profound opportunity for the social masks to come off and people to show up as very authentic, complicated human beings with baggage, and it just creates a different culture. So I really encourage people to check out the tool, and I'd be happy to offline share the tools that I use and how I go about that.
If you could send those too, we can also add the links into the follow-up report. So that would be great if you can send those over.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. The other thing that I have as sort of a reflection is that I have become more emboldened in my teaching to really state that social innovation and social change work is both political by its nature, and whether you call it deeply personal or spiritual, it's about values and the kind of world we want to create. And I've become less afraid to take risks around saying that. And I'd love to see more, risk taking to, that's it.
Thank you. And I want to take your class. What I find in my class too, the classes that I've taught around this, is I try to provide those kind of opportunities that you're saying, to take those masks off. And sometimes I feel like as a nod to Blake, I feel like when I'm getting the syllabus approved, I have to kind of hide it in. I don't, I'm not highlighting these personal development pieces. For example, I brought this amazing poet, Cedric Hamid, in, who works at the Visible Man Academy in Florida, and he works with young, elementary school students. But I had him work with my, MBA and across Yale students, and he comes in and we talk about, they have to read a really difficult piece about race issues and the history of that in the United States. And then they just do poetry for the day, and he gives them prompts, right? And so, I kind of describe it as a gift to my students, but the reality is that if they can start to open up and connect and be vulnerable in the classroom, and deepen into the things that matter to them, then I think it just helps not just the classroom, but their future work. So, how do we just make that clear that, hey, that should be in every classroom, because that's how we create great spaces to be in, right? So thank you for highlighting that. Other questions here? Education suggested courses. Oh yeah, so the School of Systems Change Academy for Systems Change, right, Josh? You were part of that. Do you want to highlight? Someone's saying their courses for educators, and then of course we've also said Ashoka U, and you can either request to teach at their exchange or offer or there's definitely going to be offerings at the exchange to touch on this. But Josh, you want to talk about the Academy?
Well, I think that the Academy for Systems Change is a great example of a group of folks who are focusing on awareness-based practices for systems change and cultivating that inner work, the inner orientation that's required to be able to address these complex challenges using these tools and methods. They have a fellowship program. I'm a fellow with them right now. In Canada, I think that there are groups like McConnell Foundation, for example, is funding a variety of projects that are in essence about building these kinds of capacities and competencies. Specifically, Darcy Riddell's work is really highlighting both systems change education here in Canada, but then also global field building with multiple different programs and approaches across the world. the work of the Social Innovation Institute in Toronto and Social Innovation Canada as an emerging practitioner network for developing these competencies is one I would highlight, somewhat selfishly perhaps, in that right now we're working to create a national curriculum for social innovation that is really activities, tools, methods available free and open source online for practitioners to use. So we can say more about that in the follow-up, but I think that this report highlights many different places. I think another one, I know some people are on this call as well, from OCAD and their design programs there are incredibly beginning to build these capacities, as well as Systems Thinking Ontario and David Ng's work and Peter Jones. So without going into too much detail, again, right, I think there's tip of the iceberg conversations in any one capacity area, and there are more programs than ever before. And this language, as Daniela pointed out earlier, I think is one of the things that we're all grappling with. How do we talk about what's the essence of this work to invite it in a meaningful way?
Great. I noticed a question from Anna about building partnerships, relationship between academia and public sector. I know that there is a new center at Stanford, and I'm forgetting the name, but it's got innovation in it and social in it. And they are grappling with that question too. But what they're doing is they're creating a fellowship for academics to help them make their research practical for both the public sector and the private sector. And basically, how do they make it? How do they make their work practical for social impact? Whoever's going to take that forward. So how do they create these partnerships? And I think that we can all be doing things like that. So they're basically creating a fellowship for academics to do that. And I think there's probably ways to do that by taking others into the university. And another example, I just want to touch on that looks at the value of inner work. I think the conversation's changing, right? It really is changing, not just in academia. I just came across or connected to a community foundation. It used to be called the Richmond Community Foundation. It's now RCF Connects in California. And they have always, I guess, offered training on different skills that leadership teams of nonprofits might need. But they now offer coaching, but somatic coaching, which means that it even includes body work, right? So they are basically offering body work and coaching to executive directors of the nonprofits in their community. I love that, right? So how do we think about that in our classrooms, in our, in the way, these are well beyond our classroom, right? We oftentimes offer executive coaching or maybe career coaching, but how do we broaden that out to recognize that like somatic presence and all these things are related to our students' leadership abilities in the future and their ability to create positive impact in the world.
Well, and I just, as we're sort of coming down to our hour, I want to make sure that people are tracking in the chat that there's lots of resources that people are sharing around programs and approaches, some of which we're mentioning and some of which are great ads. One, for example, that I'll just focus on is that Marta Cerrone, who's part of the Academy for Systems Change, and also was at the Yale gatherings, so whose work is featured in the gallery work and other places. Hi, Marta. Just shared the Systems Field Book, which is also open source and free resource online for practitioners and learners in the field. One of the things that I would just say, sort of as we come to our close, is that I think a lot of what this points to is a desire and an intention across the field to rethink how we learn together. And what are the practices and methods that enable us to rethink how we learn and shift the systems of education so that we can be more systems-led, as Daniela likes to say, or that we can be actually rethinking what innovation means and what relational innovation means, such that we're building cultures, relationships, and impacts that actually does lead towards desirable futures. So it's this weird mix of great optimism and great challenge in the face of the challenges we're facing. So it's an odd mix, I would say, but I feel really thankful to get to have these kinds of conversations with folks who care about this as well.
Great. And there's so many people on this call. It's impressive considering that this is kind of a niche topic. So there's clearly interest with the question of like, where do we take this further? I mean, I would love to see future gatherings. I'm sure just like at our small one at Yale and the number of gatherings that have been hosted by McConnell and others across Canada. If there is anyone that's willing to host that or support that, speak up and reach out after this or on the chat now, and I'm sure that that there will be interest. So I'm definitely interested in that. If you have other ideas for how to take this forward, you can either speak up quickly in our last few minutes here, or follow up in the follow-up emails, which will also include Josh and my personal email as well, I'm assuming, in case you want to reach out to either of us. Is there an open source wiki for systemic problem solving? There are so many different niches of this, but I don't know if is there one that you want to share, Josh, that you're thinking of, or is there?
Well, it was already put in the chat, but David Ng put in the chat Systems Thinking Ontario and a few other links that are open wikis, or as I understand they are. And again, as Daniela just said, I feel like there's many that are, but I wonder in regard to this idea of next steps, I think that part of it is what is the consistency of conversations that we might have that would be helpful and supportive to us as practitioners or educators? What are the kind of convenings that we need to be able to build the field and to develop the relationships to address these challenges? And also, where are the places of practice that this is happening already that we can feature and highlight? And I know Daniela's work and my work and many on the call offer platforms to be able to share those stories. And I think that the more that we can, that would be a great next step in all of this as well.
Yeah, and we need cases in the classroom, right? That's another piece, and I'm sure some of you have those or ideas for those. I know that Paula wants to take the last minute. Is there any pressing thought or question that people want before that? Cases, that is. Someone says they have ideas for cases. So, Paula, since they have your guys' email address and not Josh and mine right now, can things get sent to you? Can they just... does everyone have an access to at least one email address at McConnell that came from this? Or she's going to share that right now. Go for it.
You will have my email address when you registered for this webinar. And so any resources that you wish to share can be directed my way.
Yeah, and so then Kelly is already compiling a follow-up email that has a lot of links that we pre-prepared before this call, but she's already also been collecting the ones that have been shared here. So we'll make sure that those are all in the follow-up email, as well as Josh and my email address in case you want to reach out to us. But thank you for coming and joining us. I know that this is quick and speedy, but hopefully we've shared some resources. I've already learned about some resources that are useful for me to learn about too. So there's more links getting stuck in here as well. Hi, Gail.
Just a quick thank you to you and Josh as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Yeah, we'll be sending an email out with all the great things that were shared and all the next steps that we talked about. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Great.
Bye.
Looking forward to seeing you in the field. Bye-bye.
And someone asked, can you assign the readings? My syllabus is in there, so you'll get that too. Okay, ciao, everyone. Bye.